Afghanistan blame game.
The West's embarrassing defeat in Afghanistan has created a harsh blame game inside the United States. Politicians keep trading jabs to escape accountability in the wake of American forces' chaotic withdrawal and swift takeover of the Taliban.
And just going back to the beginning of this year, obviously I can't quote the titles of the pieces, but let me suffice it to say that there are numerous pieces that would be categorized as it's going to hit the fan. And but let's just for a moment put that aside, okay? Because I think any analysis of those pieces would have led anyone to that conclusion.
Hello and welcome to We the People. I am your host, Daniel Arya, and in this episode, we'll try to get to the bottom of how America's awkward position is impacting politics inside the United States. With the military taking drastic steps in that turbulent withdrawal, it was natural that a finger-pointing escapade would follow, but today it is extending beyond expectations as the U.S. makes efforts to protect its reputation as an old empire. Stay with us.
We have stated many times that no one anticipated, the vast majority, I should say, there may have been individuals and agencies, so I don't want to eliminate that option, but our national security team and no one in Congress, or I would say most people out in the public, anticipated that the Taliban would be able to take over the country as quickly as they did, or that the Afghan National Security Forces would fold as quickly as they did. So even the content of the reporting is consistent with what we've said many times publicly. I'll also note something that the President said in his press conference around the same time of this reported phone call. The Afghan government and leadership has to come together. They clearly have the capacity to sustain the government in place. The question is, will they generate the kind of cohesion to do it?
Just this past week, the blame game was extended to Congress, where a show was put up to justify the mess. Secretary of State Antony Blinken was grilled by lawmakers from both sides of the aisle, demanding answers to difficult questions left unanswered for decades.
Secretary, the American people don't like to lose, especially not to the terrorists. But that is exactly what has happened. This has emboldened the Taliban and our adversaries.
Assuming it's not classified, can you tell us where you are today?
Yes, I'm at the State Department.
Oh, couldn't be bothered to come down here and see Congress. All right, that's great. Hey,
Sir, excuse me, sir. My understanding is that the House is not in session, and that's why the session is.
I'm right here, Secretary. So the chairman, says the ranking member. We're here, Mr. Chairman. Reclaiming my time. Did state at any point in the evacuation process block American citizens from leaving Afghanistan?
No, we did not.
At least two Republican members of the panel called on Blinken to resign at the contentious congressional hearing.
For years, U.S. leaders had vowed to withdraw forces from the war-ravaged country, but had never managed to pull it off. Yet, in the complex power play of U.S. politics, one thing led to another, and ultimately, President Joe Biden had to do the job, and with that decision comes the repercussions. We're now joined by journalist and author Daniel Lazare to hear his perspective on the issue. Welcome to the show, Daniel.
Glad to be here.
Now, Daniel, considering Secretary Blinken's testimony before Congress, how do you think that internal tensions over the U.S. defeat in Afghanistan will play out now?
I presume that Biden will pay a substantial price for the way the withdrawal was handled. I think the withdrawal was chaotic, very badly organized. Obviously, the administration had no idea how weak the U.S. puppet government was in Afghanistan, and therefore was taken by surprise by the speed of the collapse. And so I think that Biden will pay a substantial price for that misjudgment. And I think it'll hurt the Democrats a great deal in 2022, but it's very hard to tell because those elections are still, 13 months away or so, or 14 months. So we don't know what will happen in the interim.
And thank you, sir. That was Daniel Lazare there joining us from New York.
Soon after the U.S. military invasion of Afghanistan 20 years ago, America's defeat had become evident. But it culminated in the hastily organized evacuation that left thousands of U.S. allies and military equipment behind. Ending the war sparked the biggest crisis of President Joe Biden's administration, less than a year into the White House. with some questioning his authority by suggesting that others are making important decisions behind the scenes.
As in every case, ultimately decisions that can only be decided by the president are decided by the president.
Well,
Now, of course, to be specific, Senator, there are hundreds, thousands of decisions every single day that go into a situation as complex as this one. The big strategic decisions, those are decided by the president. The tactical, operational decisions are made by different agencies, agency heads, agency officials.
well, I'm more interested in the top decision making. Look, we've all seen this. We saw it as recently as yesterday. Somebody in the White House has authority to press the button and stop the president, cut off the president's speaking ability and sound. Who is that person?
Infighting among liberals and blame game involving conservatives is nothing new, but it has gone as far as both chambers of Congress now, where the U.S. Secretary of State was grilled over the administration's handling of the end to America's longest war in history. Our next guest is Garland Nixon, radio talk show host and political analyst. Mr. Nixon is also an outspoken civil libertarian and First Amendment advocate, currently serving on the National Board of Directors for the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU. Thank you for joining us, sir.
Oh, you're certainly welcome. I'm glad to come on.
Now, what role do you think the Biden administration, sir, and more specifically, the U.S. State Department under Secretary Blinken has played in the chaotic withdrawal of U.S. forces from Afghanistan?
I'm a firm believer that the chaotic withdrawal was intentional, that the military and the neocon war hawks worked together to make sure that the withdrawal was chaotic, that it was messy, that it didn't work out well. So from now on, they're going to make the argument that the problem is not that we occupy countries or get involved in these wars of occupation. The problem is that when we leave. So if the United States says we want to pull out of Syria or pull out of Iraq, their argument's going to be, oh, no, no, no. Remember what happened when we left Afghanistan. So now the big boogeyman is going to be, we can't leave these countries.
Thank you, Mr. Garland, for joining us.
Blinken's two-day testimony before House and Senate panels demonstrated how America's top diplomat was stuck with consequences of the decisions by leaders atop the hierarchy of power in the United States. For one thing, Blinken had to defend the U.S. legacy 20 years after invasion.
These are things that we deserve to know better answers, have better hearings on this. I do not believe a word that you're saying on this.
Simply put,
I do not wish to hear from you. I'm not
simply
yielding you a
put,
moment
Congressman,
of,
what you
I'm
said
not
is
yielding
dead
you a moment
wrong.
of time. I don't wish
There
to
was
hear
no
your lies.
manipulation
You've
of
heard your
intelligence,
lies when you stand up
period.
in front of the camera.
And
Not listening
you
to
have all been
Don't wish to hear
regularly
your lies.
apprised of the intelligence
no, thank you for your
assessments.
lies.
The
gentleman's time.
Not looking to hear
the gentleman's time has expired.
And so has the
The
secretary.
gentleman's time has
Yes,
expired.
so has the secretary.
The secretary can answer the question.
I didn't ask him a question.
You did ask a question.
I don't want to hear from the secretary.
The gentleman's time
he lies
has
to us when
expired.
he steps in front of the camera.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Secretary Blinken, for attending this hearing and for your patience with putting up with the theatrics of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle.
And I'm proud of the
In 5 hours of testy exchanges with lawmakers, Antony Blinken had no choice but to defend President Joe Biden's decision to pull out of Afghanistan. He poignantly told lawmakers, "We inherited a deadline. We did not inherit a plan from the former Trump administration."
America's top diplomat was also forced to justify the clumsy stature bestowed upon the United States, not just in Afghanistan, but in the rest of the region and the world. After all, U.S. nemesis across the globe, such as China and North Korea, are taking advantage of the defeat to remind their counterparts that U.S. imperialist adventurism is doomed to fail. Now, do you believe that the Biden administration should have withdrawn from Afghanistan, or whether it should have withdrawn in this manner?
Well, I think the Biden administration played a very bad role. I mean, and Biden himself. I mean, bear in mind that Biden was a vocal champion of the war in Afghanistan from the very beginning, from before it began. He was an advocate of the war. And he said that that George W. Bush would go down in history as a great president, quote unquote, because of the way he was handling the Afghan invasion. So Biden was celebrated the war. He championed it. He was able to engineer approval in Congress. He was at the time head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, therefore one of the most powerful people on Capitol Hill. And he did a great deal to make sure that Congress went along with the war. So he was an early champion.
Thank you, and stay tuned for more.
Since war hawks such as George W. Bush, Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld engineered the Middle East project, withdrawing forces from Afghanistan to end the war has been the elephant in the room. On the one hand, US leaders have sought to speak to the anti-war masses, vowing to bring US soldiers back home and ending the unpopular war. But on the other hand, they certainly don't wish to be portrayed as losers.
I've advocated for an end to the Afghan war for over a decade. I'm glad it's finally over. But never in my worst nightmares could I have imagined that an administration would leave $80 billion worth of weaponry to the Taliban. Dozens of planes and helicopters, thousands of armored carriers, hundreds of thousands of automatic weapons, and worst of all, 13 of our brave young men and women. Never in my worst nightmares did anyone or conceive of such a colossal incompetence. Abandoning Bagram Air Force Base will be remembered as one of the worst military decisions in our history.
The general attitude changed in the Biden administration in the wake of an ever-increasing division boosted by former President Donald Trump. The Republican president clinched a deal with the Taliban, obliging the next administration to end the war, putting everyone in the government, especially the State Department, in a very rare position. Generally speaking now, what do you think the U.S. legacy in Afghanistan is after 2 decades of occupation?
I think the legacy, there's a couple of things. Number one, greed. Number one, the world gets to see that the United States used Afghanistan as a money laundering operation. I think the puppet president leaving, running off with, upwards of $150 to $200 million in cash was a perfect example of what Afghanistan was all about the whole time. The numbers are out. Between $2 and $2.5 trillion was laundered in Afghanistan. And when I say laundered, here's what I mean. We've also found out that 90% of the money that was spent in Afghanistan never left the shores of the United States, that it simply came out of the U.S. Treasury and into the coffers of mainly 5 major weapons manufacturers.
Now, the U.S. may have left Afghanistan today, but the killing of civilians still continues through the use of assassination drones. In one of the latest acts of its 20-year war on Afghanistan, the United States fired a missile from a drone at a car in the capital, Kabul.
I am now convinced that as many as 10 civilians, including up to 7 children, were tragically killed in that strike. Moreover, we now assess that it is unlikely that the vehicle and those who died were associated with ISIS-K or were a direct threat to U.S. forces. I offer my profound condolences to the family and friends of those who were killed. This strike was taken in the earnest belief that it would prevent an imminent threat to our forces and the evacuees at the airport. But it was a mistake, and I offer my sincere apology. As the combatant commander, I am fully responsible for this strike and this tragic outcome.
The strike left 10 innocent civilians dead, among them 7 children. General Kenneth McKenzie, head of U.S. Central Command, claimed full responsibility for what he called a devastating mistake, offering only a vague apology, which was immediately dismissed by families of the victims. Considering how the killing still continues, how do you think that U.S. defeat in Afghanistan will influence the status of partisanship in Congress and infighting among Democrats?
I think it'll intensify it greatly. I think that the atmosphere on Capitol Hill was already poisonous, with Republicans and Democrats at each other's throats. This gives a weapon to the Republicans to sort of argue that the Biden administration is incompetent and overextended, and I think that will bring an extremely bitter and angry response from the Democrats. So I think the infighting on Capitol Hill will intensify. As for the Democrats, I think that the Democrats are, for the moment, standing solidly behind Biden. But I think as I said before, the AUKUS alliance, the very provocative U.S., Australian, UK alliance towards China will divide the Democrats.
The war made Washington spend trillions of dollars only to quit in disarray and defeat, after leaving hundreds of thousands of Afghan civilians dead. Fast unfolding events in Afghanistan are complicating the power play in U.S. politics, as various factions attempt to evade accountability.
This was a conditions-based agreement, and the conditions were not being followed by the Taliban. They violated it in many respects in terms of not breaking their ties with al-Qaeda. They have now attacked the provincial capitals. I don't see President Trump as one who would sit back and allow a defeat on this magnitude. When I talked to his National Security Advisor, O'Brien, he told me that the president told him he would never allow for Saigon to happen under his watch, and that was during his administration. I don't think you'd see the same result, but I also think, as President Truman said, the buck stops here. This president can't blame the prior administration. He has to take responsibility and accountability.
The U.S. tried to root out al-Qaeda militants, many of whom are now returning to power under the guise of the Taliban. Daesh Takfiri militants are still present and planning to gain more ground in the absence of U.S. forces. How the situation in Afghanistan is going to pan out remains to be seen. But what is woefully clear is America's failure, its tragic consequences for the Afghan people, and ramifications for the country.
The United States knew for many, many months, our Pentagon knew for many, many months that we were going to leave, but it appears they made little or no effort to take $100 billion worth of equipment out of there. The Pentagon likes to have a lot of equipment. They want a lot of equipment. It's not reasonable to believe that they were unable over the many, many months that they had to prepare to leave. It's not reasonable to accept the argument that they were caught by surprise, they were blindsided, so they just had to leave this equipment and run out. That's not so. So they did it intentionally, and they bashed up some of the equipment and left it there rather than take it to show waste, to show error, to show flaw, so that they could argue that it was leaving is a big mess, leaving is what's expensive.
The U.S. has officially evacuated forces from Afghanistan and may be pivoting towards Asia in an attempt to gain advantage in conflicts in the Far East, involving China, Chinese Taipei, North Korea, Japan, etc. But the Biden administration is already stuck with the image the world now has of the U.S. military's inability and impotence to bring about real change.
China's President Xi Jinping says Beijing will provide more help to Afghanistan to eradicate terrorism. He's been speaking at a meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, dominated by the crisis in Kabul. The alliance includes India, China, and Russia. Niha Punya has more.
This was the 21st meeting of the group that's being seen as a counterweight to NATO, but the first since the Taliban seized power in Afghanistan. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi used his speech to urge the 9-member bloc to develop a blueprint to effectively deal with extremism and radicalization.
What remains clear is that the weight of U.S. threats is increasingly lessening in countries with anti-U.S. sentiments. Thus, this remains to be a grave challenge not only for the Biden administration, but also for upcoming U.S. leaders.
Well, I think what will happen is where do we go next? But I don't think there will be any infighting when it comes to empire and war. The sad thing is that now, as I like to put it, it's out of the frying pan and into the nuclear fire. The Democrats are going to argue that Joe Biden is great. Look what he's done. He's ended a war. But the fact of the matter is, it wasn't a war. It was an occupation. Number one. Number two, Joe Biden made it clear that he was doing this so he could take these troops and this equipment, well, what we didn't leave there, he could take and move to confront Russia and China. And the crazy thing about that is the U.S. pretty much was run out of Afghanistan by a bunch of guys in Toyota trucks, and now they want to go against superpower militaries who have the ability to defend themselves. So it's not logical that the United States would pick a fight with other world power military.
One of the main culprits repeatedly targeted over the situation is the Trump administration. President Biden keeps pointing the finger at his predecessor, arguing that he had to evacuate forces from the war-ravaged country in the backdrop of the former president's agreement with the Taliban.
When I came into office, I inherited a deal that President Trump negotiated with the Taliban. I stand squarely behind my decision. The Afghan military collapsed, sometime without trying to fight. American troops cannot and should not be fighting in a war and dying in a war that Afghan forces are not willing to fight for themselves.
He points out that, after all, it was Donald Trump who shook hands with the militant group, obliging U.S. forces to leave by the end of August. Many critics of Biden argue that although they agree with leaving Afghanistan, they certainly take issue with the unseemly scramble from Kabul and the totally chaotic way in which the plan was executed. One example frequently mentioned is the Bagram Air Base.
Well, that's the Bagram Air Base is a controversial point. The question is whether the U.S. in closing its largest air base in Afghanistan, its main air base, prior to the withdrawal, therefore deprived it of the means to execute a speedy and effective and efficient pullout. And I suspect there's probably a great deal of truth to that. Certainly, the peremptory way in which the U.S. Abandoned that air base without even notifying the Afghan government, just leaving in the middle of the night, was a huge blow to the Kabul government, deeply demoralizing, a sign that the U.S. had little faith in the ability of the Kabul government to hold the line.
Ever since the U.S. acknowledged the embarrassing defeat by Taliban, the GOP has changed its policy of promoting withdrawal of U.S. troops from other countries, while admonishing Joe Biden for not listening to the military. Lack of coordination between the military and State Department diplomats is becoming increasingly evident, as the U.S. government remains undecided about the best course of action to take.
No, I think the decision to withdraw American and NATO forces was a catastrophic mistake. I think this has sacrificed a strategic objective we've had these last 20 years to prevent a repetition of the 9/11 attacks. I think that strategic objective remains valid, and I'm very worried not just about what's going to happen in Afghanistan. I'm very worried about the implications of this mistake for the U.S. and the West as a whole. As our adversaries analyze what we've done here. I think we're going to pay for this for a long time.
The Biden administration will obviously have to grapple with the repercussions of the Taliban takeover of the country, both inside and outside the United States, well into the future. And that was our show, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm your host, Daniel Arya. We'll see you next week on another episode of We the People. Bye-bye for now.